Hello, everybody, and good afternoon. We are continuing with program 19 from the externalization of the hierarchy. I read ahead just a little bit, and we've been talking about two opposing forces. And I'll just begin here. Such a dual possibility confronts us now in terms of the New World Order, that is. One, new, right, and spiritually oriented. The other, ancient, evil, and undesirable. Whether man will go forward into the better way of life or permit the perpetuation of the old ways and the domination of selfish personal, national, and racial interests remains yet to be determined. So we are in a essay here that is written, an article from April to May 1940. There's quite a few articles here by the Tibetan in short order, so things must be serious indeed. Two things are, however, obvious to us as we look at the present world situation. First, that the lines of demarcation between the two ways of living and the two objective attitudes are far more clearly defined than at any previous time in the history of humanity. Remember what Christ said, I come to bring not peace but the sword, and in this case it means the sword of discrimination. Secondly, that it is the muddled thinking of the vast masses of well-meaning people, many of them not immediately implicated in the world conflict, which is largely responsible for the slowness of the final crisis and the postponement of the advancing decision. Well, as we saw from some of the early articles, the Tibetan had anticipated 1942 as the conclusion of the war. Now, do we mean that he thought it would be won on the inside by 1942 esoterically and then be perpetuated for a while, or did he think that was the end? In any case, it did go on longer, it appears, than he anticipated at first. For decades, we, the teachers of the race of men, have watched certain great world or planetary tendencies take shape, assume defined and pronounced outlines, and become conditioning potencies. This shaping and definition was essential if the issue was to be presented with clarity to humanity, thus enabling a basic choice to be presented to the sons of men, and the placing in their hands of certain determinations which could, if rightly directed, carve out for them a new and better future. So let's just say hierarchy saw all this slowly taking shape because of the ongoing decisions of humanity to go in certain directions. And now, he says, more clearly than at any other time in human history, the lines of demarcation, I think, between good and evil are are pronounced more than at any other time in human history. We remember that in the case of the Battle of Kurukshetra, Arjuna was bewildered, confused about where he should put his strength, or with none. And eventually, under the guidance of Krishna, which was the Christ consciousness, as Krishna was an earlier incarnation of the Christ, Arjuna made up his mind to throw his forces, his energies, on the side of the higher part of his family. Such a presentation has never been possible, because never before has mankind been at the stage where it could grasp the situation intelligently or been so closely and rapidly interrelated by the radio, telephone, the press, and the telegraph. And just imagine what our interrelation is now compared to when this was written 80 years ago, or almost 80 years ago. The needed choices can now be made in cooperation, in consultation, and with open eyes. And we still have choices to make. When we look at the resurgence of fascism, of Nazism, of dictatorship, of national selfishness, we still have choices to make. We are not out of the woods yet, as they say, and one can only hope that the Tibetan saw something which he imparted to Foster Bailey in the early 1950s, stating that there would be no final nuclear war. The choice is clearly before the thinking people in every country, and upon their decision rests the fate of the less intelligent masses. Hence the present responsibility of the national leaders, of the representatives of the people in the government, of the churches, and of the intelligentsia in all lands, without exception. There should be no shirking or evasion of responsibility. There is, however, much. Well, everyone has to make sure that he or she does not shirk the evident responsibility. You wonder, how much can you get out of yourself? And really, always more, at least more than we think. In past communications, I have oft spoke of the forces of light and the forces of materialism, meaning by these terms the controlling trends towards brotherhood, right human relations, and selfless purpose, and those which reverse these higher tendencies and bring into human affairs selfish acquisitiveness, emphasis upon material interests, brutal aggression, and cruelty. The two positions are clear to the unprejudiced onlooker. Yes. Page 213. Okay. And 214. Well, these are the trends, and I think we all can see them, even though today they may seem closer together and in some ways more difficult to distinguish because we're not in a global shooting war. But still, these two greatly divergent interests are at work influencing humanity, influencing all of humanity in different ways. The thinking group and the desiring group. To these two groups, I would add a third. The third group is taking shape in the world today with extreme definiteness and is composed of those who throw the weight of their influence and of their action on neither side. Now, is this what we call neutrality? Let's see what he says. Theoretically, they may advocate the higher way, but practically they do nothing to further its interests. And so I think we see that he is not approving of this third method. This third group is formed internally of two groups. First, those people who are potentially weak and are therefore ridden by fear and terror, feeling that they dare not move in any way against the forces of aggression. And secondly, an intrinsically powerful group who, through selfish material interests plus a sense of separative superiority or distance from the seat of trouble and the domination of false values, hold aloof from the situation and shirk their evident responsibility as members of the human family. This latter group includes, among others, a number of powerful democracies and republics. I guess we can review the history of the period and find out who they are. Fear, terror, and a sense of helpless futility govern the reactions of the one, and who can criticize selfishness and separativeness control the other. So first, let's get these clearly marked so we can, contrast them. And here it is. Well, in the battle of the individual, as the dweller and the angel contend, eventually sides must be chosen. There may be some astrological signs in which the choosing of sides does not occur and a balancing process occurs. We know in Libra, of course, the mantram there is let choice be made. But once we move into the Scorpio area and think of how much it is that humanity is ruled by Scorpio, the die is definitely cast and choice is made. In Scorpio, it's very hard to maintain one's neutrality. It's interesting how much the Tibetan wrote against neutrality as the war progressed. And I think, even before us today, we have choices, and we have to, as disciples, do what Arjuna did and do what the Tibetan recommends, throwing the weight of our power and our skill on the side of that which leads to brotherhood, right human relations, a more unified, happy, fulfilled humanity. You have, therefore, in the world at this time, three groups of people who embody the three major views of the whole of humanity, plus the unthinking masses, swayed by propaganda, controlled by their governments, and the prey of the loudest voices. And what do we have here? Demagoguery. It is of value to you to get this picture clearly in your minds, and I would like again to define them. Every good teacher knows when some re-emphasis is necessary. Okay. So there are four, really. The masses are not determining, they are determined. So we have those who are definitely against the forces of light, those who are definitely for and with the forces of light on the higher cosmic etheric planes, and those who, for reasons of fear or selfishness, do not choose one or the other, but remain in the center. And one of those groups remaining in the center benefits from that position, maybe in material ways. Okay, so I would like to define them again, he says. So here they are, and maybe we gain some additional insight about it. The ancient entrenched forces of aggression, of material acquisition, and pure selfishness working through a pronounced cruelty which reaches out and grasps what it wants, irrespective of any other rights, historical and legal possessions, or the will of anyone. Well, human beings have behaved in this manner, and certainly the members of the Black Lodge behave in this way. Those who would normally be seen as having rights have, in the eyes of these evil types, no rights at all. Then, the forces of spiritual purpose embodied in the will to protect the rights of others, along with individual rights, to end aggression and its consequent fear, and to throw the weight of their combined influence on the side of the most spiritual values of human freedom, of the right to think, and of kindness. I use the word kindness advisedly because it embodies the idea of kinship, of brotherhood, of right human relations. It is world goodwill in expression, just as the will to good is the basis of any possible peace, a goodwill which would negate any premature peace at this time, because the latter would give time for the forces of materialism to consolidate their gains and prepare the way for future aggression. Kindness, will to good, and peace, such should be the practical expression of the formulated intention of those who are conditioned by the forces of light. And we did see, how high a group this group of forces of light really is when it was explained or analyzed when the first invocation was explained or analyzed. Okay. So, obviously as disciples, it is with this group number 2 that we wish to throw our lot. Does the choice still exist before us? Most definitely it does. And not to choose correctly can lead to that external worldwide shooting war, which the Tibetan basically says must not precipitate. Then here we have the force of mass negativity as expressed today by the dominated people in the strongholds of aggression and by the neutrally minded people everywhere. So 2 groups express this negativity. They are all colored by racial fear, by the instinct to self-preservation, and by short-sighted selfish interest. So neutrality is selfishness. And those who fear and those who are selfishly neutral are named as the, quote, mass negativity. Yes, okay. And I suppose, deep in the psyche of everyone, this kind of choice is being made already. There are those who definitely stand with the forces of light. There are a few who consciously stand with the forces of obstruction and of form. And there are others who are either so dominated or so selfish that they will go with neither. They will not threaten or attempt to threaten. They will not be a resistance against the oppressors. Think about how the Czechoslovakian resistance arose, how the French resistance, the Greek resistance, in many European countries, the resistance arose, and not just when it was shown that the Nazis were weakening. Yes, some came in at that point, but others came in simply because they could not tolerate this kind of oppression, and many lost their lives. The problem is one of exceeding difficulty because even though the lines of demarcation are becoming steadily more distinct, yet the exponents of these 3 groups are to be found in every land and among all people, in every church, and in every home. As Master Moria has said, those who are sitting around the same dinner table at home may be moving in very different directions. Some toward the alliance with the forces of light, and others in a very negative direction. No nation or group is exempt from this triplicity. And think about today, Is there a danger to democracies? Some people see it. Some people are part of the danger, and some people don't take sides in this issue. And some people are simply members of the masses, and they are thoughtlessly swayed by ruthless and quite effective demagogues who will do anything to preserve their power. No nation or group is exempt from this triplicity. It is rooted in human attitudes, and that is why this conflict is a strictly human conflict and not a European war. I mean, it really did spread all over the world. And, was a world war, and in the future, any war of this nature must and will again be a world war, and possibly a fast one because of the horror of the weapons which now exist. Every nation has its selfish, aggressive people who believe that might is right and that men must be governed by the law of the jungle, taking what they want no matter at what cost to others. All right. And it is true, and can one identify these people in the political arena? Every nation has those within its borders who see the vision of right human relations, who seek to live by the law of brotherhood, and who respond to the influence of the forces of light and of the spiritual hierarchy. The forces of light are maybe a bit higher than the spiritual hierarchy, as they have been here presented, and who desire peace, kindness, and goodwill to rule world affairs and control the policies of government. And maybe in your own nation you can identify these people. Every nation has also within it those neutrally minded people who fail to think clearly, who seek to place the blame upon the shoulders of all except themselves, who theorize and speculate, advise, and assign responsibility, but who refrain from any active participation in the processes of adjustment from reasons of pride or unwillingness to pay the price. Many of them are group conscientious objectors who will eventually profit from the victory of the forces of light, but who refuse to share in the struggle, reserving themselves for the future peace settlements, longing for the conflict to end, but doing nothing to bring that about. Many are entirely sincere, but their thinking needs adjustment. Well, there are also those conscientious objectors who are out there on the battlefield not carrying a gun, but tending to the emergency and medical needs of the soldiers. And that's particularly vulnerable placement. So not all of these people are necessarily selfish. Some are so extremely sincere that they will participate in the war effort, but without the necessity of killing. If you will rightly grasp the reality of the statements made above, you will do your share in the mental clarification which is going on in the world, either through, writing or speech, persuasion, contact with those who can hear the words and possibly be influenced in the right direction. These three groups are functioning today and are in conflict. The neutrally minded group is definitely hindering the work of the forces of light. Yes. Okay, and I think, that some of this, let's just say that hierarchy has sometimes a different view than the popular view. I mean, Gandhi is viewed as a great ideal of peace, but at the time, the refusal to take sides and even the allowing of the cultivation of Nazi forces within India caused the hierarchy to be critical of his non-involvement with the forces of light, because after all, the patient was dying, and there would be no humanity except an enslaved humanity remaining in which to celebrate the peace, through which to celebrate the peace and take advantage of the peace. These three world attitudes are to be found in every nation as well as the consciousness of every single individual. The realization of this may enable you to grasp and shoulder your individual responsibility better. You will realize the need to ascertain for yourself where you stand and will refuse to be conditioned by other people's points of view and the worldwide propaganda. There is truthful propaganda, and there's also the big lie, and there's also the limited propaganda from the strictly human point of view. You will appreciate where your nation stands and on which side, and where you, as a soul, stands. As a soul stand. You will then be able, if you are sincere and clear thinking, to work for that group within the whole, which seems to you to embody the highest possible activity and aims, and you will relinquish that attitude of futile negativity, smug neutrality, or bewildered confusion, which may distinguish you. And we might say that he seeks to dissuade disciples from neutrality, and that, I think, would hold even today. And in the days when he was not advocating so much the choosing of sides, he was not advocating neutrality. He was advocating an attitude of positive goodwill, which was to be advanced at great labor. You will then emerge from the glamour of propaganda and of world illusion into the clear light of your own soul, whose essential nature is love and selflessness, and whose major aspiration is to bring peace and goodwill among men and to see the consummation of the mission of the Christ. So you will then need to ascertain for yourself where you stand and refuse to be conditioned by some very, very persuasive propaganda. Now, the negative German people, as he is often referred to them, were much conditioned by the propaganda. They have the liability of the Pisces personality, and impression is easily made upon them, especially an impression which activates self-pity because they felt they have been mistreated by the Peace of Versailles, and the very positive, the very active negative forces took advantage of that. So he's asking for really clear thinking and seeing and participation in the process which will consummate the mission of the Christ. Yeah, this is important. If you are sincere and clear thinking, you will then be able to really work for the Christ in all of these areas. What about today? Well, political abuse, the deluding of the people and wrong education, financial abuse everywhere, luxury which reserves beauty for itself, the addiction to luxury of certain wealthy people who then enjoy the beautiful but for themselves, technology for the sake of destruction. I'm going through the rays, you see. An idealism which is so narrow it demonizes and certainly precludes other ideals which have something of value, and the wish simply under the seventh ray to materialize an order, because the Axis powers had an order too, to materialize an order which suited their aims and which was non-humanitarian, cruel in fact, and exalting one nation or a few over all the others. And so again, the part was triumphing over the whole. Now let's go on a little more. This will lead eventually to the disappearance of so-called neutrality upon Earth. There may be certain incarnations when the values of the personality and the values of the soul are balanced until a decisive blow can be struck by the soul for the expression of the soul, but it cannot be perpetuated forever, and certainly not in the midst of a crisis when not to choose sides is to weaken the side which must manifest and which is to carry the divine plan into manifestation. So the disappearance of so-called neutrality upon earth will occur, a neutrality in act, for there is never neutrality in thought. That's very interesting. Okay, because it is cowardice so often that prevents the neutral from acting in the correct way, even though they may have a preference one way or another, or have decided in thought upon the value of one way or another. Okay, friends, chronometer problems again here. Sorry, I'll do my best to estimate reasonable on the hour or half hour kind of programs. So we're talking about the disappearance of neutrality upon Earth, and an interesting thing is said, a neutrality in act, for there is never neutrality in thought. People do, by and large, I would say, have their opinions as to which side is the correct to align with. One of the things which the spiritual leaders of humanity have sought to do is to bring clearly to the attention of men the basic duality which is found in the world today, the duality of selfish material living and of unselfish spiritual objectives. This is now clearly defined, and certainly we have recognized this in Master Decay, and we are familiar with the whole conflict of the dweller and the angel, and throughout his work, this has been, in fact, discussed. The second stage of their task now lies ahead, and that is so to stimulate the vision of men everywhere that, and note this, because, we have to work with those people who can recognize perhaps the value of what we are saying and its reasonableness. that beginning with the intelligentsia, they can consciously take their stand under one or other of the two banners and so know what they are doing and why. The neutrally minded waver between the two and to date do nothing. Master Moria has some very graphic things to say. Well, in the Bible it said that the lukewarm are spewed out of the mouth, right? You remember that. And in Master Mori, speaking of the battlefield, he says we have no time or respect for the worms that crawl on the battlefield in the mist. They are people who are not taking sides in the battle. I guess we can see it precipitating on Earth to a degree, but as students of esotericism, we realize that it's far more serious than the evidences of it. And eventually the actual precipitation can begin to equal in seriousness what lies behind as a propagating cause. I would like in this connection, he says, to deal with one problem which has somewhat disturbed the clear thinking among those whom I have for sometimes sought. I have for years sought to develop in the world a group of men and women who would stand for spiritual values, who would love all men, all human beings, who would foster the spirit of goodwill, and who would stand to humanity as far as they could as the hierarchy of light, as Christ and his disciples seek to do. As the hierarchy of light, as Christ and his disciples, the masters, seek to do, standing toward us, and especially standing towards humanity, that we could imitate that somewhat. He has for years attempted to do this. This has been interpreted by some of you as meaning that you must refrain from rebelling against the evil thing in your midst, and from all criticism and partisanship. You seem unable to love with steadfastness the offender, and yet to rid the world of the offense. All right, this is a very important thing, that we condemn the sin, but not the sinner. And he's telling us that we do not seem to be able to distinguish between sin and sinner, and that in fact, if we hate the sin, he's suggesting that we also feel we have to hate the sinner, which of course is, it's not the way things must be. And we have discussed this, the willingness, let's say in the martial arts, to kill the enemy, but to have no hatred in so doing. I suppose believing in reincarnation, and also realizing that the best thing that can be done at that time is to eliminate the enemy. Do you believe that the hierarchy of light, okay, the situation might clarify if you answered to yourself one or two questions. Do you believe that the hierarchy of light under the leadership of Christ is on the side of cruelty, aggression, and the slaughter of the defenseless? Well, is this not so obvious that there's no way any thinking person can believe this? Do you believe that the hierarchy of light under the leadership of the Lord of Love, the Christ, is on the side of cruelty, aggression, and the slaughter of the defenseless? Do you believe that the world can be saved by a refusal to think and by the shirking of individual responsibility, thus ignoring a situation which does exist? Again, any honest person, especially honest aspirant or disciple, has only one way to answer. Do you feel that there are no issues and principles which are worth fighting for and dying for if need be? Well, how can you answer that, Of course, the death of the physical form is not the worst thing that can befall an individual or befall the human race, but in the case of the human race, the anchor must be preserved, otherwise everything has to start again. Do you stand with the forces of light or with the forces of materialism? How can one answer in any other way than we stand with the forces of light? What are you doing then to aid the side which claims your allegiance and loyalty? DK had told some of his disciples, you're doing less for the war effort than people who are completely ignorant of the esoteric causes of these things. Are you governed by a sense of individual futility, that weapon which the forces of materialism are using now so potently to stun possible opponents into helplessness? Well, these are just very straight questions, and what honest aspirant or disciple can do anything but answer them in one way? It's more than one or two questions. It's several. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Is that it? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 questions. Yep. And, if we answer truthfully according and in the light of the soul, and if we have conviction of the truth of the laws of the soul, is really only one way to answer. And of course, we would discover in ourselves any shrinking back from responsibility if there was hesitation in answering these questions. A clear and searching analysis of the spiritual objectives of humanity will enable you to answer these questions. If you do not need to answer them because your position is clear in your mind, the study of the questions may enable you to serve your day and generation more ably and to present the situation more clearly to the bewildered. Present these questions to those who must be taught and must decide. I think, to draw to the attention of people the nature of these questions certainly will confirm in those who have not thought about the matter their position and make them more powerful. And so, even today, I keep on coming back to today because that is the relevance during this, what I must call a third, though thus far subtle attack on human values, the best values of humanity. It's going on, I believe, in light of that subtle undermining of the best values of humanity, which is now occurring. We have to answer these questions. No, I don't feel futile. I am definitely, any one of us, am definitely trying to advance the ageless wisdom and the Objectives of the hierarchy of light. Yes, I stand with the forces of light. Yes, there are issues and principles which are worth the sacrifice of the physical form. And no, the world cannot be saved by refusing to think and shirking one's individual responsibility. And no, the Christ would never stand, and his hierarchy would never stand on the side of cruelty, aggression, and the slaughter of the defenseless. The defenseless would have to be protected, as no doubt they are in ways, occult ways that we can not yet fully fathom. A horror of war and a longing for peace are no excuse for slack thinking, nor do they provide an alibi or the opportunity to shirk individual and national responsibility. I mean, again, you see that the reader is being subjected here by the Tibetan master to what I can only call a chastening, a kind of rational chastisement. The conflict is on. It is of ancient lineage. The conflict, even for us, is not over. The issues are clearly marked between right and wrong, between cruelty and kindness, between aggression and freedom. I was reading, or I was seeing, somehow I just get this sense of participation in World War II, which must be obvious from many things I've said and my attitude. And I was noticing how when Japan was on the brink of surrender and the Soviets were attacking from the West and the United States and allies were attacking from the East, the Japanese chose to surrender to the Americans because they knew their treatment would be far more humane than surrender to the Soviets. It's true the Soviets sacrificed greatly. The Russians and all of those people sacrificed greatly in the Second World War. But when it comes to the issue of kindness, of civility, of issues of cruelty and so forth, there's no question but that the Western democracies have an advanced position, at least at that time. Thus it was. The conflict is on. It is of ancient lineage. The issues are clearly marked between right and wrong, between cruelty and kindness, between aggression and freedom. To evade responsibility because of past national mistakes and historical sins and failures is an unwarranted alibi. I mean, there are all kinds of ways that the psyche, the unobserved psyche, can trick us into making selfish and cowardly decisions. The shirking of due participation in the struggle because every nation has certain materialistic objectives is wrong. A nation is but the sum total of its people. To refuse to think because the general condition of fatigue in which you share, because of the general condition of fatigue in which you share, is no excuse and is unworthy of disciples and aspirants. So obviously the Tibetan is pushing his readers towards taking sides with the forces of light, with the hierarchy of light, and with the effort to save the psyche of humanity and even its physical anchorage upon the globe. Save humanity from inevitable enslavement, which was clearly enunciated by the Axis powers when saying how should we deal with the inferior groups after we win the war? Okay. The hierarchy of light is seeking to arouse men everywhere to the basic dualism underlying this conflict and to the essential significance of the issues with which humanity is faced. As we know, graduates from Earth School are adjudicators between the pairs of opposites, that's the phrase, and the pairs of opposites are blazingly obvious in their quality at this time, at the time that this was being written in the 1940s, before America entered the war, and when so many of the nations of Europe were under the jackboot, but not yet England, and not ever Great Britain, not ever, which is one of the great victories, I suppose, when you transport reincarnationally the Roman military into England. There's a certain amount of first-ray resistance, which made it far more difficult for Germany to achieve the capitulation of Great Britain. Hence the emphasis which I am laying upon the need to face the problem, to think clearly and intelligently about what is going on around you, and to take right and cooperative action. Well, DK, no question, let's just say he is pushing this choice and the action required. The whole world problem will be clarified and the end of the conflict more rapidly reached when there are only two parties and not three. Well, that's just so clear. It's the exhortation to take sides and to somehow admit that the presence of this intermediate party, which basically does nothing except talk, is delaying the resolution of the war. And maybe we have to look at that today also. Who are the people standing between the red of Mars and the blue of Jupiter? It has to be resolved according to the soul nature of humanity, the Buddhic soul nature, and eventually the love-wisdom soul nature of humanity. Of course, the people involved and representing the different points of view have no idea of these things, but we have to find a way to present them so that indeed, they do develop an idea of what the choice means. The recognition of, esoterically too, right? The recognition of this underlying dualism is necessary prior to the shifting of humanity's consciousness away from its major preoccupation, acquisitive material desire, aggressively obtained, into soul consciousness with its correlations, group interests, the meeting of group need, and the functioning of a steady group cooperation on a world scale. So recognize dualism, recognize good and evil when they are playing out in front of you and, in your own life, because the same battle is going on for all of us, really, until the third degree, and even then there is a battle. It seems that every time one is to move up an initiatory level, some kind of conflict between the established better way of the higher and the existent lesser way of the lower is staged. So this is true of individuals, of nations, and races. Okay, I've been saying that as you, an individual, work out your own problem in your daily life, you are helping to solve the world problem. Well, we are warriors. We have a lot to do with the sign Scorpio. Leo may be the most human of all the signs in some way, but Scorpio rules the main arena on the Buddhic plane of our particular creative hierarchy. Okay, this is the situation as hierarchy sees it today, and with which it challenges all men and women of goodwill. So this kind of material is supposed to reach the men and women of goodwill as well. They ask you to share in the conflict in some way. Even now, there is a conflict. Let us detect it and find a way forward into a more humane civilization where the needs of all peoples on the earth are taken care of, certainly in a reasonable manner and according to the need, not according to some distorted desire which serves the lower ego. They ask you to share in the conflict in some way and remind you of the occult significance of those oft misunderstood words of the Christ, "He that is not with me is against me." Well, do we accept the challenge? I think we have to, and there's no honorable way to evade that or consider what's happening is not important. 6 years remain until the great hierarchical conclave. Maybe we say, oh, that's just the affair of hierarchy. But if you check the, can I find this? If you check the charts, you will see that, yes, I'm looking in the wrong place. Sorry, that's going to be actually in the D disk, and it's going to be AAB diagrams, and it's going to be the solar and planetary hierarchies, and you'll see that the blue circle of hierarchy includes people on the probationary path, who are the aspirants, and it includes all disciples and initiates. Yes, I mean, that's what the map seems to show, within that circle. People on the probationary path, the aspirants are there, the disciples are there, and the grades of initiates are there. They are included. And so we have to have the attitude that is common within hierarchy, not to the same degree of intensity, but we have to mirror and emulate that attitude. In closing these remarks upon clear thinking, which certainly we all agree that we are meant to exercise today, I would add two more. Clear thinking. See it as it is, all of us, because one of the major weapons of the forces of darkness is to confuse and bewilder the opposition, which is anybody allied with the forces of light. I would like to add two more. There is some confusion arising out of the basic idealism which underlies the activities of many people in many countries. It is the importance of the somewhat new ideal of the good of the state as a whole versus the good of the individual and the good of humanity. So it is a problem because some people adhere to the good of the state, which is not entirely, the good of the nation, which is shown as patriotism. The state becomes almost a divine entity in the consciousness of the idealist, and that, of course, goes too far. This is necessarily part of the evolutionary plan, but insofar as it constitutes a problem, it is too big for the individual to solve alone and unaided. Because, the state can trample out the rights of all who seek to express themselves within, let's say, a national or state boundary. It's the obliteration of the individual, and that is not desired either. The value of the state and its soul is desired, but that's not a contradiction between bringing the state into a position of expressivity and allowing the individuals within it to express their God-given will, which carries indeed an aspect of the will of God. Now, what I'm going to say here is that my chronometer is totally off, So I'm going to assume that 1 hour has passed, and maybe. And then I'm just going to, I'm just going to reset the whole thing and start again. So one of the fundamental truths I can, however, assure you, when men everywhere within the boundaries of their particular state, and whilst upholding its authority and its civilization, begin to think in terms of mankind, so, to act locally, statewide, and to think universally, that is humanity, globally, then public opinion will become so potent and so right in its inclusiveness that state policies must inevitably conform to the larger ideal, and the sacrifice of the individual and of humanity in large numbers to the individual state will no longer be possible. So we support the values and the good of our state, but we think in terms of the one humanity, and then our state and all states begin to respect, through public opinion, the one humanity. The part will be seen in its proper relation to the larger whole. It is this arousing of public opinion to world rights, to inclusive human interests, and to international cooperation that is the true goal of all present endeavor. And it continues today. I mean, I'm an American, I guess, in this particular incarnation, and I cannot abide this the resuscitation of a tainted motto, America First, used as a kind of Trojan horse during the 1930s to side with Nazism. Eventually, it will be realized that the responsibility for what governments do rests squarely upon the shoulders of the individual citizens who put governments in their position of power. When we have a nation with a terrible voting record and such a small percentage of the people votes, then the fanatically tinged minority get their way. So the individual responsibility has to be really understood, and the right to vote, which so many have given their lives to protect, must be respected, and people carry out at least that, to think about who we are really putting in areas of responsibility and offices of responsibility, and the effort made to at least show up at the polling place to make one's thought into an action. So, upon the individuals within any government, within any nation, the responsibility does lie. And maybe only, I hope not, but maybe only loss again of that right will show us what we've given up and make us fight once again to reclaim the right to vote. This is a responsibility from which no citizens of any nation are or should be exempt, and to this all national thinking of the right kind is fortunately awakening. World rights, not just the right of your nation first. World rights, humanity's rights as a whole, and not just the rights of your particular nation. Well, this is learning to live beyond one's apparent ring pass not. We think we are thus and so, and yet if we really go within and discover that the kingdom of heaven is within, which means that our true identity is within, then we can begin to live into the other members of humanity as if they were ourselves. So this first part here, it has to do with thinking of the one humanity, even as one thinks of the welfare of the best parts, the best qualities of one's own state or nation. Now, the next aspect, the second point I would briefly add is that when the precipitation of the present world situation, the citizens of all nations are involved in a condition from which there is no escape except through right action and wide vision on their part. No escape. Well, you begin to know when there is no escape, the issue is dire and must be solved, because it is an unfortunate pattern of human beings to go out the back door of the cave. You've got the Hercules and the lion is always escaping. Hercules has to confront the bestial aspects by locking the door or barricading the door of escape. To this world situation, they must conform their lives temporarily, patterning their activities upon the needs of their own particular nation. But it's always the word needs that's really important, and not the inflated and oftentimes megalomaniacal goals of some psychologically unbalanced leader. Don't know how those people somehow manage to get in positions of power when they are so psychologically deficient. For those who are swept into the world conflict under one or other of the clearly defined banners, because the possibility is either way, just as, even after the second initiation, one can veer off on the left-hand path. So for those who are swept into the world conflict under one or other of the clearly defined banners, their immediate action is clear: participation in the national emergency, the war effort, as it was called. Who was the lady? She had a bandana, and it was she worked in a weapons factory, and she was making, showing the capability of women. She was just in the news, and I think she may have just passed away, but it showed symbolically what women were contributing, even in the so-called work of men, to the war effort. This is, however, wholly compatible with the subjective process of right and clear thinking, which must run parallel to the demanded outer activity, which will lay a foundation for increasing right action as time elapses. So we can think within in a very humanitarian manner, and we have to carry on without that which will fulfill the needs, true needs of our state. Now, obviously, need and desire are two different things, and many people don't even think about need. They confuse them. When they desire something, they say, I need it. But an honest approach will not make that possible. There's so many things we can do without, and in the simplifying of life comes its spiritualization so often. This will involve right action on the part of those who are fighting under the forces of light, and will lead to an eventual right and just peace. So it is possible, to fulfill the needs of the state and still hold that inner spiritual attitude, the subjective process of right and clear thinking, and inner spiritual attitude, which must run parallel to the demanded outer activity. We can't just rest back and say, okay, look, I know I'm in a nation, the nation is fighting a war, but I'll go on with my life and not even contribute thought to the needs of my particular nation. Okay, so this will involve right action on the part of those who are fighting under the forces of light and will lead to an eventual right and just peace. Right action, right thought, clear thinking, all that, It will involve also right action upon the part of those who have been swept into a bewildered activity under the forces of materialism, leading finally to a revolt against that which is wrong and evil, for the hearts of all men and the springs of divine life are not to be permanently directed into wrong channels of activity. I'm thinking about Italy, and I'm thinking about the partisan revolt toward the end of the war, in which fascism was overthrown and Mussolini was assassinated and overthrown. So even those who were working, I mean, it is true the resistance movements became stronger as one went along. Yes, it is true. But even when it was not safe, well, it was never safe, but when it was much more dangerous to revolt, those who were standing on principle did revolt. The responsibility for the immediate world moves, and the present gigantic national enterprises is now out of the hands of the control of the individual. This is 1940. Okay. The responsibility for the future, nevertheless, still lies in his hands. That is, we cannot solve the huge motions, the huge moves, as he says. But thinking of the future, the responsibility for the future and its developments when we have the coming of the New World Order, ideally, is still in the hands of the individual. This shouldering of right responsibility must be preceded, however, by an interlude of clear thinking plus right action as a citizen. Is there anything here which does not apply to the present moment? And I would, my answer on that. It all applies to the present moment. And we have to care, just caring about our own advancement as an individual, even along positive lines, is selfish, self-centered. It's to be expected of many, but when you're an aspirant or a disciple, it's not expected of you. The problem of those living in neutral countries is different, and along what lines it should be solved, I have earlier indicated. I mean, there is a choice to be made, and the position of neutrality in action cannot be sustained, and DK submitted to us certain questions which would move us from our position of either fearful or selfish neutrality. Now, today, if we are neutral to the outcome of the present battle between the selfish financial interest, let us say, and dictatorial powers on the one hand, and the welfare of humanity on the other, if we're still in that neutral position, then we ask ourselves those 6 questions, and we try to decide accordingly. Really, there shouldn't be much effort in the decision at all. As for the world disciples and aspirants among whom you range yourselves, the entire problem can be seen along still wider and more comprehensive lines. So this applies to people of our type who are studying these matters and seeking to be members of the new group of world servers and who are learning esotericism and the various ways to serve esoterically and factually. You are forced by circumstance and karma and by the free decision of your souls to work under one or other of the two banners or in some one of the neutral and negative countries. You are forced. We hope that by giving us that option that we could be working with the negative, with the materialistic powers, we will be so repelled that we'll throw ourselves into the work of the spiritual hierarchy and all those who support its position. Your problem in all three cases is to see clearly the spiritual focus of this world crisis and to swing the weight of any influence you may have, objective or subjective, spiritual, emotional, or mental, on the side of the forces of light. This is our problem, and hopefully, even though we have no world war, we do have a subjective world war still occurring. And we know that the way things usually work, the rich will continue to get richer and the poor will fall into an impossible situation where sustaining life with adequate food, shelter, clothing, and free from disease will become impossible. So there are decisions to be made right now in this widening gulf between those who have power and those who simply are downtrodden and have no opportunity. So we have to swing the weight of any influence we have onto the side of the forces of light. I trust that those who have gotten far enough in this video to read what is said and have done so. As you do so, you must preserve an understanding attitude of steadfast love, not sentiment or emotional reaction to men and women everywhere without any exception or reservations in your consciousness. Now, that is such a statement that even as we swing our attention, our gifts, our contributions onto the side of the forces of light with such a definiteness that we cannot refuse it, that it cannot be misunderstood, that we maintain this steadfast love. That action has to be taken at times, which hurts or damages the form side of life or the physical form, is entirely compatible with the constant preservation of soul love, a thing which it is hard for the disciple to learn and to master, but which is nevertheless the governing principle in evolution. I mean, one may have to kill the enemy and still love the enemy, you know. It's not loving the enemy's form per se, although in ideal circumstances one helps the form of all human beings so that they have an instrument through which to express their growing soul potencies. But at times in the dire exactitude of war, it may be necessary to kill the form without losing the non-sentimental love of humanity, preserving the understanding attitude and of steadfast love. We know that people, they lose the body, but their next circumstances are better. And they will have more spiritual opportunity and be less compelled by these overwhelming forces that have presently conditioned them in the wrong way and taken away their opportunity. This world crisis and the present world war will, it is hoped, awaken men to the realization that the form side of manifestation, with its aggressive selfishness, its cruel emphases, and its separative tendencies, carries inevitably with it the seeds of its own eventual elimination and the unavoidable results of pain, suffering, war, disease, and death. Awakening our eyes open to see what are the results of living according to the demands of the form side of life, which is a lower side of life than the soul center generates. This situation is therefore of man's own making and the result of his material nature and lack of soul control. But the soul is eternal, meaning consciousness is eternal, not the vehicle of the soul. Consciousness is eternal, at least returning cyclically forever. Its nature is inclusive love, and the whole aim of the present crisis is to shift the focus of human awareness out of the form and the material aspect of living into the consciousness of the soul, and to do this at any cost to the hindering forms. It is against this transference of emphasis that the forces of materialism are today fighting. So we might just say, okay, this is the reason for the war. This is an esoteric reason, okay? An esoteric reason for World War II. It's of mankind's own making. Here I'm going to make this bigger so that it can be sufficient. This is the situation. This situation is therefore of man's own making, and the result of his material nature and lack of soul control. But the soul, that is consciousness, it's a divine principle. It is cyclically eternal, and I just want to kind of put that down. Cyclically. Oop. No. That's the problem. So, where do I go to get a useful bracket? Here. Okay. Right here. So, it is cyclically eternal because we always return to the absolute. Its nature is inclusive love when we have consciousness of the whole. The soul really ultimately is consciousness of the whole. And the whole aim of the present crisis, and that's so interesting, is to shift the focus of human awareness out of the form and the material aspects of living into the consciousness of the soul. That's the aim of the war. And to do this at any cost to the hindering forms. Okay, the whole aim, I've got to, don't I? I have to make that stand out because it is a point that we need to hold in our consciousness. The whole aim of the present crisis is to shift the focus of human awareness out of the form and the material aspect of living into the consciousness of the soul, and to do this at any cost to the hindering forms. And of course, the forces of darkness, being profound materialists, being named forces of obstruction and forces of materialism, naturally fight against this transference. They don't want that because it means the eventual success of humanity. I know I'm making things pretty big here, but this is just so that one can really see where the emphasis lies. For this reason, humanity is swept into a vortex of conflict, and the issue depends upon the clear thinking, wise speech, and selfless intent of the world disciples working in collaboration with all the forces of good in the world today, doing their duty as citizens of their country, but cultivating ceaselessly and unrelentingly a world consciousness. So this is what you call acting locally, but thinking globally. Thinking globally, universally, but acting locally within one's nation. Now I'm coming, I am going to be forced to make this simply a program of an hour and a half, and I'm just a short time away from that. So we began on page 213, and we're on page 222, and it's about, as I said, my chronometer went a little wacky here. It's about, let's see if I'm in the right place. Am I in the right place, or have I gone beyond that? Yeah, I did go beyond it. I never know how long a program I'm going to be able to do, but I try to keep it coming to you. We need to think the Tibetans' excellent ideas into action of a positive kind which advances the divine plan. We need to do that. And what better way than to study seriously together? It takes time, I know, but he didn't write that just for his own edification. He wrote it for our edification. So this is 213 to 222, and our date here is the 12th of February. And we'll see, it will be the beginning of program 20, and it'll be from 222. We'll see when it's possible to do anything, maybe later today, because we are starting a new topic, divine intervention. And, divine intervention is interesting because, well, let me just see what happens here if I put, no, that's the wrong thing to do. The topic is divine intervention. Okay, so, and usually we try to let humanity work out its own problems. And as I said, a big intervention had been planned by of all things, Solar Logos in 1917 or so. I think just before America entered the war. I have to check. I don't know, did Canada enter the war before that? Because they were allied with England, and England was deeply in the war. That's World War I I'm speaking of. But divine intervention is usually of such a drastic nature that we try to, hierarchy tries to avoid it and hope that humanity can work out its own issues without such a imposition of a tremendous power. Now, there was, in a sense, a divine intervention. From Shambhala through the Lords of Liberation, and I suppose freedom, equality, and brotherhood, or freedom, brotherhood, and equality, I suppose they are shambolic beings. We know the spirit of peace is extra-planetary. We know the avatar of synthesis is extra-planetary. I'm not sure about the Lords of Liberation, but they certainly are from the realm of divinity on our planet. that realm of divinity, especially the second subplane and the first subplane of the cosmic physical plane. And indeed, they did intervene, being justified in doing so by the invocatory, even if inarticulately invocatory power of humanity. And basically, they turned the tide of the war. Because there was sufficient invocation to call them forth. So I think it'll be a very interesting discussion here. And let's just see if in this year 1940 it is anticipated or not. All right, well, my chronometer, probably lying to me in some way, is telling me I've passed an hour and a half. Okay, so that's the duration of this particular program, and I'll come back to you with program number 20 as soon as I possibly can. Let's all study these things deeply, study everything of the Tibetan deeply, deeply, deeply. Absorb, assimilate, apply, and thereby work for the manifestation of the divine plan as much as is within our power. Okay, lots of love, many blessings, and we'll see you soon. Okay.